We've seen so far that for much of the 20th century, Bronislaw Malinowski's anthropological critique, Sex and Repression in Savage Society from 1927, remained the most influential argument against the universal Oedipus complex. Its impact was felt profoundly within psychoanalysis and across all the social sciences. On the basis of his field study in the Trobriand Islands, Malinowski claimed to have discovered a distinct matrilineal complex and to have proved that the Oedipus complex was only one type of nuclear family complex. He further argued that Freud's theory was an example of ethnocentrism and that the Oedipal conflicts reflected a pathology of Western patriarchy. So far from being universal, the Oedipus complex was a symptom of paternal authority out of harmony with human biology. By contrast, the matrilineal complex was far closer to an ideal state of human nature, according to Malinowski. In this final part of the first lecture on the universal Oedipus complex, we'll look more closely at how Malinowski's critique of Oedipal theory and later versions of it, continuing into the present, failed to hold up under scrutiny, even within its own discipline, anthropology, only to be revived in ever new forms within psychoanalysis, again, right up to the present. So the first half of this last part will focus on anthropology, and then we'll finish up discussing the developments within psychoanalysis. The odd twist in the history of this controversy, represented by anthropology finally returning to Freud's anthropological theory only to be rejected in psychoanalysis, is only one of the many ironies that have characterized it, as I've tried to show in the last few lectures. Still another example of this irony was the fact that Malinowski himself, to the credit of his brilliance as a pioneering ethnographer, provided sufficiently descriptive ethnographic detail to enable others like Jones and Roheim to refute his own thesis. Perhaps the greatest testimony to the authority of Malinowski's critique in both disciplines was the 30 years that would have to pass before another anthropologist would even attempt a follow-up study in the Trobriand Islands to test Malinowski's data and his interpretations of them. So the 1957 Powell ethnography, the follow-up. Unsurprisingly, the follow-up ethnography conducted by H.A. Powell in 1957 confirmed much of Malinowski's basic ethnographic data. What it did not confirm were Malinowski's interpretations of his data and the critique of Oedipal theory that he based on them. The realities of Trobriand kinship simply didn't refute Malinowski or Freud's universal claim for the Oedipus complex, as Malinowski had asserted. It was an empirical fact confirmed by Malinowski himself that the Trobriand child's early caregiving relationships were, quote, essentially no different to those of upbringing in any elementary family, whether under a patrilineal or a matrilineal kinship system. The overt pattern of interpersonal relationship in the Trobriand elementary family presents much the same picture as that found in many other societies. A man and a woman, united by the marriage contract, are responsible for one or more dependent children, whom they bring up as members of a single household, end quote. Anthropologist Marvin Harris would later underscore this problem entailed in Malinowski's thesis of a matrilineal nuclear family complex, in which the core system of sentiments flowed not from the familiar nuclear triangle of mother, child, father, but instead from the triad of sister, brother, maternal uncle. Harris re-emphasized that Malinowski himself admitted that the Trobriand child, quote, this is Harris, the Trobriand child is brought up largely under the influence of the usual nuclear pairs. Mother's brother enters the picture only when the child is 7 or 8 years old, an age by which the Oedipal constellation is firmly entrenched. End quote. The Powell reanalysis in 1957 also confirmed the Trobriand father's role as the early authority figure and disciplinarian, in addition to the mother, of course, which Malinowski had denied in spite of his own evidence to the contrary. Once again, it was an empirical fact that, quote, during the critical years of personality development, until the age of about 6 or 7, it's the father, not the mother's brother, who personally represents authority, instills such discipline and obedience as is required, and generally trains the boys during their time of residence with him, end quote. Powell's correction regarding the father's role correlated also with a more accurate interpretation of the maternal uncle's influence over the young boy, his nephew. Powell continues here, quote, "The mother's brother is prevented by the respect relationships between himself and his sister from interacting personally with her children until after they reach an age by which the bases of the personality are already laid. To this extent, therefore, there is little reason to suppose that he, rather than the father, should become the authority figure in relation to the child. Rather, it seems that the psychological relation between father and child is essentially the same under the Trobriand matrilineal as under the patrilineal system of formal kinship." End quote. Now on converging reconsiderations. These observations exposed the logical problem at the heart of Malinowski's critique and affirmed the positions taken by Jones and Roheim in the earlier debates. Remarkably, however, the extraordinarily significant follow-up study by Powell, conducted 4 decades after Malinowski's own fieldwork, would go largely unnoticed or ignored within anthropology for another 25 years. In spite of this baffling fact, individual voices, however, within anthropology were converging towards similar conclusions. And by the late 1970s, advances in object relations theory and new information on the role of parents in socialization led British anthropologist Mayor Fortas to anticipate some kind of reconciliation of the views taken in the Malinowski-Jones-Roheim debate. Fortas rendered his own verdict in favor of the Freudian position, calling attention to the matrilineal societies that, against Malinowski's thesis, quote, argue plausibly for a normal, if well-disguised, Oedipus complex centered on the parents in early infancy, end quote. He concluded that, quote, anthropological findings for the past 30 years or so of the social and personal relations of parental and filial generations in matrilineal family systems in many parts of the world tend to support a Jonesian rather than a Malinowskian interpretation of the situation, end quote. Fortas's endorsement of the Freudian position carried a great deal of weight within anthropology. Not only had he been trained as an anthropologist under both Malinowski and the latter's own teacher, Seligman, but Fortas had also earned a PhD in research psychology before turning to anthropology. His ethnographic studies on African kinship, kingship, ancestor worship, and divination, in other words, the very stuff of Freud's Totem and Taboo, had become a standard in studies on African social organization and comparative ethnology. Coming from someone of his standing within British social anthropology, the testimonial was analogous to the famous so-called confession in 1951 from Clyde Kluckhohn, one of the most reputable theorists in American culture and personality studies. Kluckhohn's confession is always worth repeating at length, in my opinion. Here it is. Quote, "The facts uncovered in my own fieldwork and that of my collaborators have forced me to the conclusion that Freud and other psychoanalysts have depicted with astonishing correctness many central themes in motivational life which are universal. The underlying psychologic drama transcends cultural difference. This should not be too surprising except to an anthropologist over-indoctrinated with the theory of cultural relativism, for many of the inescapable givens of human life are also universal. Human anatomy and human physiology are, in the large, about the same the world over. There are two sexes with palpably visible differences in external genitalia and secondary sex characteristics. All human infants, regardless of culture, know the psychological experience of helplessness and dependency. Situations making for competition for the affection of one or both parents, for sibling rivalry, can be to some extent channeled this way or that way by a culture, but they cannot be eliminated given the universality of family life. The trouble has been because of a series of accidents of intellectual and political history that the anthropologist for two generations has been obsessed with the differences between peoples, neglecting the equally real similarities upon which the universal culture pattern, as he put it, as well as the psychological uniformities are clearly built, end quote. Concepts like human nature and the Oedipus complex, so closely tied to evolutionary theory, were casualties of the more extreme versions of cultural relativism that Kluckhohn was referring to. Malinowski's original critique had been reinforced by others, like Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa in 1928 and Benedict's Patterns in Culture in 1934, far and away the two most popular implementations of Boas's charter for cultural relativism in American anthropology. Mead had characterized the mandate from her mentor as, quote, merely the documentation over and over of the fact that human nature is not rigid and unyielding, end quote. Freud certainly wouldn't have disagreed with that human nature is not rigid and unyielding, end quote. Singer summed up the ever more relativist versions of this charge in a phrase, quote, it's not human nature, but only our culture, end quote. Freud would certainly have disagreed with that, as we'll see. By mid-century, however, a role for cross-cultural universals and biological determinants in theories of human adaptation was becoming more acceptable again within anthropology. Singer pointed out that Kluckhohn only grew more insistent in the last decades of his life that the Oedipus complex was among the many identifiable cross-cultural universals. Lest the significance of this shift be underestimated, we can recall Mead's more extreme cultural relativist statement on the supposed incommensurability between different societies. This was only 4 years before Kluckhohn's confession in 1951. Quote, this is Mead. It will be necessary for psychology to assimilate and reduce to useful form the more recent findings of ethnologists which stress that a fully acculturated member of a living culture differs in every respect and systematically from members of any other culture, end quote. This idea that culture renders its members different, quote, in every respect and systematically from members of any other culture, unquote, is precisely what Kluckhohn had in mind regarding anthropologists' obsession with differences. Kluckhohn ascribed the more radicalized expressions of Boasian cultural determinism to a series of accidents in intellectual political history underscoring really their ideological bases, as opposed to their basis in empirical evidence. Roheim, speaking from within both anthropology and psychoanalysis, pointed out that even on purely logical grounds, Mead's incommensurability argument against human nature and the universal Oedipus complex made no sense. Quote, Mead's statement is absolutely incorrect on a priori grounds, for if a Samoan differs in every respect from an American, how can Mead's findings about the Samoan be valid? No empathy is possible under such a circumstance. Indeed, we might then give up writing about anthropology altogether, except about our own group, end quote. Arguably, Roheim was seen, was seeing in Mead's claim the same logical performative contradiction that I've said undercut Malinowski's own thesis. Once again, Malinowski had rejected on theoretical grounds the universal Oedipus complex because of cross-cultural differences, while also arguing for a common matrilineal complex across widely differing matrilineal societies. But the theoretical tide was changing, and only 4 years after Kluckhohn's confession, Mead would emphasize just how commensurable all human experience really is. Quote, in the study of personality and culture, we start with the recognition of the biologically given, of what all human beings have in common. Because of these recurrent biological similarities of growth, of parent-child relationships, of needs and fears and reassurances, it is possible to compare childhood in one society with childhood in another, end quote. This was a re-emphasis of Mead's position from the very beginning. It's just that the emphasis on all the differences became so dominant in the literature. Mead's reaffirmation of the concept of human nature came just before Powell's support for the Trobriand Oedipus complex, an indication of the changing theoretical landscape in anthropology by mid-century. Nevertheless, it took another 2 decades before Freud's Totem and Taboo would be itself revived for scholarly attention in American anthropology by Paul's reanalysis. In 1976, did the primal crime take place? His conclusion there was that, quote, something like the primal crime must have occurred, end quote. 2 years later, one of anthropology's leading kinship theorists, Robin Fox, wrote The Red Lamp of Incest, contributing to the rehabilitation of Totem and Taboo and Freud's primal horde theory. Although not intended to be an explicit polemic against Malinowski, nonetheless, The Red Lamp has been described by some within evolutionary anthropology as, quote, a point-by-point refutation, end quote, of Malinowski's critique of Freud. But it wasn't until Spiro's Oedipus and the Trobriands in 1982 that more than half a century after Malinowski's Sex and Repression in Savage Society, that an authoritative and explicitly polemical refutation of Malinowski's thesis would emerge from within mainstream anthropology. As we'll see, Roheim was a unique exception to this, but he could not be considered mainstream within American anthropology in any sense, at least not at that time. Spiro's formidable analysis spelled out the theoretical and empirical problems inherent in Malinowski's matrilineal thesis, along with their full cross-cultural implications. It affirmed the Powell reassessment in far greater detail, demonstrating that neither, quote, the Trobriand household nor the social relationships that obtain within the nuclear family display the characteristics that might expectably produce a matrilineal variant of the classical Oedipus triangle, end quote. Malinowski's argument was assessed to be seriously flawed on several accounts. Spiro's analysis and rigorous documentation extended to the larger cross-cultural problem also, concluding that for, quote, exactly the same reason, neither this nor any other structural variant of the classical Oedipus triangle has been reported at the total societal level for any other society, end quote. From within contemporary American psychological anthropology, Jordan and Schwartz analyzed the blow to Malinowski's argument by Spiro in this following manner, quote, "The fact that the mother is the first love object of the male child, the inference that a boy's sexual rivalry with the father seems indicated on a repressed, unconscious level, and the fact that the authority of the mother's brother becomes salient only after the normal Oedipal period is past, all conspire to demolish Malinowski's thesis. Trobriand specialists and others may dispute evidential details, their use and inferences made from them, but such critics will have a difficult time dismissing Spiro's intricately constructed case. Only new or previously uncited primary data directly bearing on the issues raised would be sufficient to invalidate Spiro's conclusions," end quote. So it's arguable that in the 30 years since Oedipus in the Trobriands, no new or previously uncited primary data have yet to emerge to convincingly refute Spiro's conclusions. It remains one of the most fascinating anomalies in the 20th century in the social sciences that Malinowski's matrilineal thesis could have been accepted within anthropology with almost no skepticism, quote, "with almost no skepticism or critical inquiry for 50 years, end quote." That was Spiro. So what we've just considered can be summarized in the following way. By mid-century, the most powerful 20th century argument against the universal Oedipus complex, Malinowski's matrilineal complex, was beginning to crack under much delayed scrutiny within its own discipline. By the final quarter of the century, it was crumbling. Spiro's analysis alone presented devastating evidence that the Oedipus complex was not only universal, but was even more intense and unresolved in the very society that was supposed to have refuted the Freudian case. To this day, it's still likely that no decisive refutation of Spiro's defense of the Freudian Oedipus complex has been offered in the very discipline from which the preeminent critique of Freud had been constructed. At the very least, then, it clearly is not legitimate to assume that the Freudian Oedipus complex has been disproved, despite many claims to the contrary. Moreover, it appears highly likely that the preponderance of findings from anthropology alone support the existence of a cross-culturally universal Oedipus complex. Okay, Oedipus waning and effacing in psychoanalysis. So what was happening in psychoanalysis as anthropology was finding its way back to Freud's anthropological theory? This question brings us to a second striking irony in the history of this controversy. For just as anthropology was rediscovering the value of Totem and Taboo and Oedipal theory, the theoretical momentum in psychoanalysis was building in precisely the opposite direction. By the mid-60s, Nahara described the increasing lack of precision, displacement, overshadowing, obscuring, and disappearance of the Oedipus complex in relation to its corollary, the infantile neurosis, within psychoanalysis. A decade later, Lowell published his observations on the waning of the Oedipus complex, his very well-known paper among psychoanalysts, an indication of the fact that the trend was continuing. This momentum away from Oedipal theory and psychoanalysis has continued well into the present. As recently as 2005, Nahara repeated his concern from 40 years earlier, writing that Oedipal theory continues to be, quote, ignored, overlooked, or more specifically, actively denied, end quote. What Lowell called a waning has become a complete effacing in psychoanalytic intersubjectivity theory, according to a recent appraisal made by Adler in 2010. This was at a conference for contemporary perspectives on the Oedipus complex. In his paper, The Effacing of the Oedipus Complex, Adler described his surprise at realizing that his own intersubjectivist text from 1998 had failed to include a single indexed reference to the Oedipus complex. Adler emphasized one particular aspect of this effacing, namely the elimination of the role of infantile sexuality in child development. Quote, that these intersubjectivist perspectives marginalize, ignore, or outright reject the whole of infantile sexuality and development further tends to dilute and obscure the place of the Oedipus complex in our contemporary discourse. The Oedipal romance may still be widely acknowledged, yet it is frequently uncoupled from the psychosexual dynamism that gives it its crucial significance as a developmental event that organizes gender identity and superego structure, end quote. Other authors, such as Green, also have drawn attention to this shift away from childhood sexuality and this decoupling of psychosexual dynamism from Oedipal theory. In truth, this trend is one with a long history in psychoanalysis. It began with the original opposition to Freud's views on infantile sexuality. It was the object of Freud's objections in 1914 to the view of life reflected, this is Freud, quote, to the view of life reflected in the Adlerian system, which is founded exclusively on the aggressive instinct, and to Jung's pushing into the background of the sexual factor in psychoanalytic theory, end quote. This earlier resistance to infantile sexuality was only reinforced by Malinowski's critique. The Neo-Freudians, Fromm, Horney, Gardner, and others, were swayed by the claim that the Trobriand Oedipal child had no Oedipal attachment to the mother, repressed or otherwise, to rival the father or anyone about him. Kroeber redoubled this argument with his call for a redefined Oedipal kernel without the superego, which he viewed as one of Freud's gratuitous and really irrelevant assumptions, quote, gratuitous and really irrelevant assumptions, end quote. That's Kroeber's phrase. Fromm answered Kroeber's call and argued that it was not sexuality, but the child's, quote, defeat in the fight against authority, which constitutes the kernel of the neurosis, end quote, picking up on Kroeber's metaphor of the kernel. It was quickly becoming hard to recognize anything Oedipal in this new Oedipal kernel. So it's this old fractional adoption and redefinition of Oedipal concepts that continues to recur within psychoanalysis and contemporary intersubjectivity theory. And as in the earlier debates, it also goes hand in hand with a rejection of Freud's cultural evolutionary theory and Totem and Taboo. Here's a contemporary example of this. Quote, Freud's mythological reconstructions of the origins of the Oedipus complex in a quaint piece called Totem and Taboo are interesting in that they show us how far away 19th century biology is from the historical present. Concepts like the Oedipus complex have disappeared completely, end quote. We'll see in a bit that Freud's 19th century biology wasn't quite so far away from contemporary biology as authors like this claim. The second half of this rejection, though, needs to be repeated. The author claims that, quote, concepts like the Oedipus complex have disappeared completely, end quote. This claim is flatly refuted by many contemporary psychoanalytic publications, such as Greenberg's Oedipus and Beyond, and those already mentioned here. We've also seen that this is refuted by the last 50 years of developments within anthropology that have been steadily undoing the most powerful 20th century critique of Oedipal theory, Malinowski's. The incompatibility of such claims with the actual research literature is no small problem for psychoanalysis as a discipline. Yet this kind of unsupportable dismissal, so sweeping in nature, is remarkably common. Here's another typical example. Quote, examination of the nature and origins of the Oedipus complex presented by psychoanalysts and critics suggests that there is little evidence to support its existence, end quote. Here the critique is not limited to the narrower debate over universality, but extends to the very existence of the Oedipus complex altogether. We're asked to believe that a fair examination of the nature and origins of the Oedipus complex would suggest that no one anywhere has ever had an Oedipus complex. Even Malinowski's thesis, the most important ethnographically grounded critique of the 20th century, never went this far. On closer scrutiny, broad dismissals like this frequently rely on the omission of essential sources of evidence in the literature. The last critique failed to mention any of Spiro's writings, including Oedipus and the Trobrians, arguably the most important interdisciplinary critique within the past several decades. The author also seems unaware of the significant Powell reassessment from 1957, and he makes no reference to Fox's Red Lamp of Incest or to any of Paul's analyses from within both anthropology and psychoanalysis. In other words, the examination simply excludes very important evidence from the research literature. On misrepresentations. Apart from the exclusion of evidence, contemporary rejections of Oedipal theory often rely on parodies of Freud's basic concepts. Nowhere is this problem more likely to occur than in critiques of Freud's concept of infantile sexuality. The last critique portrays Freud as believing that infants are born with knowledge of both sexes' genitals and that Oedipal-aged children have sexual fantasies of adult intercourse, as if they can understand what this even entails. Since the author provides no context for this claim, other than a general reference to Freud's entire introductory lectures, it remains difficult to understand on what basis he arrives at it. He simply writes without any clarification that Freud, quote, contended that anatomical knowledge of the opposite sex, as well as a desire for sexual intercourse with the opposite sex parent, is genetically inherited, end quote. Many of Freud's observations on childhood sexuality would suffice to demonstrate how misleading these kinds of characterizations are. With regard to anatomical knowledge, Freud was clear on his view that young girls and boys originally make the egocentric assumption that all genitals are like their own. That boys, for example, quote, attribute the same male genital to both sexes, end quote. In The Ego and the Id, Freud refers to a boy's pre-Oedipal identifications with the father, and then clarifies that perhaps, quote, it would be safer to say identification with the parent, for before the child has arrived at a definite knowledge of the differences between the sexes, the lack of a penis, it does not distinguish in value between its father and its mother, end quote, in the sexual sense. Freud's formulations on the castration complex, castration anxiety, and penis envy presupposed the potential anxieties children can have when first confronted with anatomical facts so at odds with their original misconceptions based on concrete thinking and egocentrism. The following passage from Freud's 5 lectures on psychoanalysis, as early as 1910, demonstrates the complexity of Freud's actual views on infantile sexual knowledge and experience. Quote, during the time when the child is dominated by the still unrepressed nuclear complex, an important part of his intellectual activity is brought into the service of his sexual interests. Under the influence of the component instincts that are active in himself, he arrives at a number of infantile sexual theories, such as attributing a male genital organ to both sexes alike, or supposing that babies are conceived by eating and born through the end of the bow, or regarding sexual intercourse as a hostile act, a kind of violent subjugation. But as a result precisely of the incompleteness of his sexual constitution and of the gap in his knowledge due to the hidden nature of the female sexual channel, the young investigator is obliged to abandon his work as a failure, end quote. Condensed into this passage are a number of essential concepts and empirical observations that remain as useful today as they were when Freud formulated them over a century ago, I'd argue. Childhood sexuality and infantile sexual theories are understood here in relation to stage-typical aggressive trends and Freud's concept of the libidinal component instincts. This latter concept pertains to the building blocks of psychosexual development and is not limited to the leading oral, anal, and genital zones. It comprises all the bodily sources of sensory excitation, all of which are associated with functions basic to human survival. The gain achieved with this synthesis was that it operationalized the question of how libidinal components emerge, compete for dominance, and eventually become more or less successfully coordinated or integrated in the service of mature object relations, conscience formation, and reproductive genital primacy. That's in the ideal case. Of course, there's all kinds of things that can make that not happen well. The advantage of the libido concept was that it applied to the entire sensory field and did so in the context of a model that accounted for the vicissitudes of the drive components over the entire life course. At least it created a framework for the possibility of that accounting to take place. Critics of Freud often overlook the fact that Oedipal sexuality must not be reduced to the genital precisely because of the importance Freud accorded to infantile sexuality and the partial drives. Freud's epigenetic view of the gradual differentiation and integration of drive components in the course of development is a reminder that the concept of infantile genital makes no sense apart from the systematic interrelation of all the component drive contributions, including the pre-Oedipal ones, and the other lines of development early in development. Otherwise, the Oedipus complex is misunderstood and reduced to intensifying genital sensations and fantasies. But this oversimplifies Freud's view of the Oedipus complex, as demonstrated in the extraordinary passage just quoted. The typical sexual theories of the Oedipal child are no less Oedipal because of their conspicuous oral and anal components. Rather, these components, along with the child's maturing ego functions, and again, all the other developmental lines taking place, are now enlisted on behalf of the emerging Oedipal trends. In Freud's words, they are, quote, brought into the service, end quote, of the child's infantile genital aims. Conversely, The meanings associated with Oedipal or infantile genital concepts are easily confounded with those of adult genital primacy. Of course, there's a world of difference between the genital experiences at these different levels of maturation and development, but this often gets lost in the language in the discourse. It must be held in mind that Oedipal sexuality remains fully infantile in every Freudian sense of this term. Consolidation of masculine and feminine identifications remains incomplete. Representations of sexual anatomy are not yet integrated into a mature self-concept consistent with genital primacy and sexual reproductive capacity. The full implications of sexual intercourse and reproduction aren't even comprehensible yet to the child, nor do their real consequences even apply. Pre-Oedipal oral and anal trends still vie for dominance over genital ones. Boundaries defining self-object representations are still very fluid and easily fragmented under stress. Thinking is still largely egocentric, concrete, and dominated by impulse, magical thinking, and fantasy, rather than the reality principle. And full physical maturation, along with emotional independence from caregivers, could still be as much as 2 decades away. For all these reasons, vaguely defined critiques of Freud's views on infantile sexuality, using phrases with highly charged adult connotations, like the desire for sexual intercourse with the opposite sex parent, will always be misleading unless they specify what this means, and specify the meaning of these terms in their proper developmental context and in the context of Freud's actual theory of infantile sexuality. His theory of the drives, his theory of object relations, they're all integrated. The explanatory power of Freud's actual theory becomes even clearer when we expand our considerations beyond individual ontogeny to the larger anthropological and evolutionary questions that Freud took up in Totem and Taboo. To do so is to bring the concept of the component drives into the service of our comprehension of how individual psychology and psychopathology manifests in specifically collective forms. After all, Totem and Taboo was Freud's first attempt to explain the causal relations between these two levels. Holding in mind the climactic deed in Totem and Taboo, the murder of the primal father, Freud's synthesis accounts for how collective actions that would appear to be an expression of the most primitive or primal or regressed drive states, oral and anal sadistic cannibalism, can be more comprehensively understood in terms of these pre-Oedipal components being mobilized in the service of infantile genital and adult genital aims. And indeed, I would argue, this is how we are to understand the primal deed. And the evolutionary transformation, on the other hand, from proto-human to human society, according to Freud's schematic reconstruction in Totem and Taboo. The primal father is killed and ingested in the service of possessing his phallic power over the horde and his genital monopoly over the females. This represents an oral incorporative form of identification brought into the service of phallic Oedipal aims at the shared level of the group. This deed, real or imagined, Freud in Totem and Taboo offered the possibility that both could be the case, although he ended the Totem and Taboo stating that he believed it actually happened. This deed is quintessentially Oedipal, I would argue, precisely to the extent that it stands without resolution and is driven by fantasies of omnipotence and idealized sexual satisfaction. Such hopes remain as futile as the Oedipal child's wish to replace the parent. No sooner is the primal deed accomplished than its victor becomes the next victim. In Freud's account, the collective solution to this dilemma over the course of human evolution, human cultural evolution, was a compromise in the form of culturally defined exogamous boundaries, exogamy, and the ritualized regulation of aggression. In other words, the structures of totemic society. The psychological corollary of this is the resolution of the Oedipus complex, the relinquishing of Oedipal objects by means of an introjection into one's own ego of the Oedipal rival's social values. Keeping in mind that the Oedipal rival includes both parents because of the complete Oedipus complex in Freud's theories. This identification results in conscience formation, the superego, and it represents a triumph of the reality principle. Conversely, just as with the murder of the primal father, no sooner are Oedipal victories of individual development experienced by the child, which can happen for many reasons, death of a parent, divorce, anything that makes the parent disappear from the child's life during that period of development. No sooner are such Oedipal victories experienced by the child than difficulties arise for the child's ability to resolve the Oedipal conflicts and move beyond them in development.